היא גם התמחות. I forgot.
That's good. Okay, next year you can next year.
Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In today's lecture, which will last about an hour, and then for those who can stay, will be able to ask questions and comment on what was said. So by 11 o'clock, if somebody has to leave, we'll know that that's the time for questions and answers. In today's lecture, I'd like to go over with you some of the characteristics of the Jewish family in the Middle Ages, with some background on the earlier period. I have given the title Monogamy, Polygamy and Concubinage, Jewish Society in the Middle Ages, because this is of course just one aspect of Jewish family life, because I thought within 1 hour it will be very difficult to refer to every aspect of family life. If, however, I see that one can add a few details about other aspects like wedding ceremonies and differences and developments that occurred in this in the course of time, I will add. But otherwise, I will start by giving a very general overview of the Jewish family from the point of view of monogamy, polygamy, and concubinage. When we speak of bigamy or polygamy, we have to refer to the subject from two angles, from 2 points of view, from the point of view of the woman and from the point of view of the man. Of course, in Jewish law, some of you may know that there is a clear difference in the case of a woman and the case of man. From a woman's point of view, the law is very clear. This is under no circumstances permitted. That is to say, a woman who is married to a man cannot, under any circumstance, according to Jewish law, have any kind of relationship with another man. And therefore, in fact, my lecture will not cover this aspect, because this has not been discussed, has not been argued or debated at any time in Jewish history. One might argue, one might debate, but it has not been actually practiced. The law is very clear on this. And what happens if, despite the law, which is very clear on the point, a woman does have a relationship with another man, either illegal, that is not under law, or supposedly, let's say, the second man, comes to her and declares the formula, according to Jewish law, a man marries a woman. That is, Hare at mekudeshet li, behold, you are wedded to me, etc., etc. What happens? Now, in this case, the law is as follows. Both men, that is, the first husband who's legally married, and the second man who either marries her or has had relations with that person, with a woman, they both have to divorce her. Now, the first divorce is a legal divorce, what we call technically mideoraita, according to the Torah. He has to divorce her because the Torah is specific, where he says, if a married woman has any kind of intimate relations with another man, she has to be divorced from her husband and cannot marry the second man with whom she was involved. And accordingly, Jewish law says that she has to be divorced from her husband according to the Torah. Now, why the second man has to give her a get or has to divorce her. And that is technically midirabanan. That is to say, it is the rabbi's decision. It is not really from the Torah. Why not from the Torah? Because her marriage anyway was invalid right from the beginning. So, but why should therefore the second man has to divorce the wife? It is in order to ensure that no person makes the mistake into thinking, supposing that he thought that she was really properly and legally married to the second man, that she was, if she was married to the second man, thinking that she was married to the second man, he might make a mistake that the woman is now free to remarry. Of course, she is free to remarry any other person except these two, her husband and the second man. Then he might think this woman is marrying somebody else without a get or without a divorce. And therefore, there is this technical divorce that was instituted by the rabbis. Now, this is in order to summarize. Therefore, under no circumstance a woman can have a relationship with two men at the same time when she was married to a first person. And in case she does, Jewish law requires the woman to be divorced from her first husband and divorced in inverted commas from the second man. And according to Jewish law, she is not permitted to any of the two, even if one of them happens to die. Right. So that even, and why? Because a person cannot, the principle says, a person cannot derive any benefit through transgression. That a man cannot profit from a situation in which there is a commitment of a transgression. Now, this is clear, I hope, as far as the woman is concerned. Some women think that this is really unfair as far as they're concerned. It is possible, however, to look at it from a different angle, that this is a privileged position. But now, let us see how, from a man's point of view, bigamy, or polygamy for this matter, is actually in Jewish law. It is well known that the Torah does not prohibit bigamy or polygamy. There is no prohibition for a man to marry more than one wife while his first wife is alive. Of course, if the first wife dies, there is no problem. Now, the law does not prohibit, but I think, to say the least, it does not encourage. Because in every reference in the Torah to the possibility of a second wife, the terms that are used are certainly not encouraging. For those of you who understand Hebrew, I will quote in Hebrew, and then I will translate. The Torah, in one instance, it says, Ki yikach ish shetei nashim, ha'achat ahuva ve'ha'achat senua. If a man marries two women, one is literally loved and the other one hated. All commentaries agree that the word snua, hated, is not hated, but is less loved. Yes, a man doesn't take a wife if he hates her. So the term in Hebrew, ahuva usnua, is loved and less loved. He prefers one of them. I don't know, I have had no experience with two wives, so I do not know whether there is a possibility for a man to share his love equally, 100% equal with two women, but apparently the Torah thinks otherwise, that by necessity a man has a certain preference to one of the women. And so, what does the Torah say? If a man marries two women, one is his beloved and the other one is less loved, just as in the case, by the way, of Rachel and Leah, Jacob did not hate Leah. He loved more Rachel. He wanted to marry her, right? And so it is not, so this is really a proof that the commentaries were right in interpreting the term hate. And now, in this case, the Torah says, if a man has two wives, and if the firstborn, in fact, is the son of the less loved wife, he cannot prefer the firstborn of the beloved wife and give him the share of the firstborn. Because according to Jewish law, to the Torah, the firstborn has a double share but also double responsibility. But it doesn't matter. So he cannot prefer the firstborn of the beloved if the firstborn of the less loved happens to be really the first, born first. The very fact that the Torah shows the difficulties confronting a man with two wives, and the fact that no man can actually prefer the firstborn of the beloved wife, just in the case of David, for example, with Bathsheba, although Solomon was not his firstborn, he did want Solomon to succeed him. So here the Torah is very clear on the subject and shows how the Torah implies, in fact, that there can be difficulties, there can be problems, and in any case, one of the wives is less loved, and this is a source of problems. And now, how does the Hebrew language call a second wife? Or what is the type of relationship between one and the other wives, if there are two wives or three wives? It is interesting, I overheard you saying it. The Hebrew word for it in later times, in Rabbinic Hebrew, is tzara. Yes. This is very interesting. In Mishnaic Hebrew, in Talmudic, in Rabbinic Hebrew, the reference, the relationship of the two women is always, the word for it is tzara. And I think here again we have the tradition followed by the rabbis of the biblical, not prohibition, as I said, there is legally accepted, but the biblical reservation about plural marriages. Now, of course, just I think we have to say one point which is of interest is that the identity of the Jew, of the child, depends on the identity of the woman. This has a lot of implications as far as plural marriages are concerned as well. So this is just to bear this in mind. Now, another instance in the Torah which shows clearly that the Torah would not be very happy with plural marriages, although they are legal. There are a lot of things legal which are not very, commendable. Here we have in the case of a king. In the case of man, the Bible does not say anything. If a man has two wives, if a man has more than one wife, and that's it. But in the case of a king, it is very clear. The Torah says, Lo yarbelo nashim. He should not have too many wives. He can have more than one wife, but of course it is understood that the king can afford and allow himself to have many wives because of his status, because of the money he has, because of the various possibilities that the candidates are more to be married to a king, even if she is fifth, sixth, or seventh wife. There were many girls apparently in those days who were prepared to do so. So the Torah says, Lo yarbelo nashim, that he should not have too many wives. Again, one can understand the reservation of the Torah as far as plural marriages are concerned. There are a lot of other things where the Torah does not say that the king should not have too many of that, but wives, yes. I think one has to add just one or two remarks here. Certainly not every man in those days could have more than one wife. First, for demographic reasons. You don't have so many women, although I don't know how to explain it, that generally speaking in history, as far as the Jews were concerned, there have always been more women than men. Some even suggest that this is the reason for the permission granted for men to have more than one wife, although without encouragement, so that women should not remain unmarried. So the possibility, because of the demographic imbalance between men and women, so that there should be theoretically the possibility for every woman to be married. But this is just a commentary on this subject and nothing more. There is another thing to be remembered, and that's of course the economic implications. The economic implications that if a man has one woman or two or three, well, there are a lot, I'm sure some of us know that. You have to have 2 wardrobes or 3 wardrobes, and later rabbinic law says that you have to have different houses. But in biblical law there is no such, but at least you have to have different tents and different, just as we know from the case of Jacob, or different quarters in the house where each of the women will be the mistress of the house. So in any case, the economic, demographic reasons did not permit every man to have more than. But we do have instances where people did have a second wife. I'm not talking about Jacob, of course, that's before the giving of the Torah, but after the giving of the Torah, we know the famous instance, of course, is Shmuel's father. Shmuel's father, Samuel, the prophet, who was actually the child of a second wife, Hannah, who had no children for a while until she pronounced a famous prayer from which Jews, in fact, from a woman, we learn how to pray, that the Amidah, the silent prayer, which is to be recited silently while just moving the lips. This is how the Shmoneh Esrei, the prayer in Judaism, is pronounced. Now, so we have instances of Hannah, we have other cases in the Bible, but there are not really many cases. We do have kings who had, of course, more than one wife. King David, who had, I don't remember if it is 7 or 8, but something in the region of that. And of course, the King Solomon did transgress the law of Lo Yarbe Lo Nashim. He should not have too many wives, because he did have many wives, and the accounts in the Bible as to the results of his plural marriages is obvious there. That some of his foreign wives led him even to almost idol worship is there. Now, throughout the Mishnaic and Talmudic periods, that is from the Second Temple period until after the destruction of the temple, we have no prohibition whatsoever. There is no prohibition, and yet we have very little information, if at all, of any person who married more than one wife. It is interesting to note that all the sages mentioned in the Mishnah or in the Talmud did not have a second wife, which is, I think, the best illustration, indication of the general refusal of the rabbis, of the leaders of the people, to practice that which is permitted by the Torah, but which is not encouraged by it. So the general tendency throughout the Mishnaic and Talmudic periods, that is, from the destruction of the first temple until a few centuries after the destruction of the temple, until the 7th century, is that more or less the Jewish family was monogamous. The only deviations that were known was when a man did not have children from the first wife. And according to Jewish law, a man who has lived with a wife for 10 years and they did not have children, he was permitted to marry a second wife. Of course, permission in any case was there, but he was permitted even if his first wife is against it, because he has the possibility actually to divorce her on these grounds. You might say, I love her, I like her, I have nothing else, but I want children. Now, of course, the implication is, or in some instances, the implication is as if it is understood that the woman's fault that she has no children. We know, of course, that this is not the case, because the possibility that it is the fault of the man that the wife does not have children is there. Nevertheless, this is the case. But when a man wanted a family and did not want to divorce his wife, he said, I want my wife and I want also children. We have instances in this period I described of almost a millennium where people did have a second wife in order to have a family. Of course, in such instances, one could easily find out whether it was man's fault that he did not have children. By the way, the Mishnah is quite aware of the possibility that it can be man's fault that there is that they have no children. The family has no children. The couple has no children. We have the instances because the woman who comes to the Beit Din seeking a divorce and claiming, giving some details of their relations, which then is assumed definitely that it is the man who is impotent or is responsible for the lack of children. Now, where does the picture change? The picture changes from the 7th century onwards. From the 7th century onwards, we have now a different situation in two parts of the world, and there is a clear distinction. The difference is between the Muslim world and Christian Europe. In the Muslim world, that is why from the 7th century onwards, after the rise of Islam, we have clear indications, we have proofs that there were now more and more men who had more than one wife. And often it was assumed that this is a continuation of the biblical permission granted to man to have more than one wife. In reality, and bearing in mind what I said about the Mishnaic and Talmudic times, the Second Temple period right until almost the 7th century, it is now clear that it is not a continuing tradition, it is not a characteristic of the Jewish family from antiquity that is now continuing in Muslim countries. It is rather the influence of Islam on the Jews. It is well known that Islam, according to the Quran, a Muslim is permitted to marry up to 4 wives at the same time. In fact, the choice of a Muslim man to have as many women as possible is really very real. How? Because divorce in Islam is the simplest thing. All he has to do is to pronounce a sentence whereby he says, I'm divorcing you. That's all. And the woman is divorced and has no option, nothing. Therefore, a man can keep the maximum of 4 wives at the time, but he can have a rota. He can rotate, he can have 10 women But as long as he doesn't have more than 4 wives at a time, he is all right. Now, this is the situation under Islam. In fact, Islam, in the Quran, there is even a good description of life in paradise of the good Muslims. And life in paradise includes also the pleasures of this world. And so that the Muslim is told that you should not worry if you seem to have certain of your pleasures restricted. 4 wives. I don't know if it's such a great pleasure to have 4 wives, but this is the implication that if you have really less than 4 wives, or no more than 4 wives, in paradise, in the world to come, you will have actually infinite pleasure. There will be no restrictions. Now, this is the tendency, and this is how things are seen, and definitely the influence of Islam, of Muslim society, in all the parts of the world where Jews lived, that made certain Jews now return to a permission that was biblically acceptable, yes, and therefore the polygamous marriages or the bigamous marriages are among the Jews from the 7th century onwards are the direct result of Islamic influence on the Jews. Now, what happens in Christian Europe? In Christian Europe, the tendency is clear. By the 10th century, there is evidence that the rabbinic authorities of Franco-Germany were absolutely against bigamous marriages. And the famous Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon, the ban of Rabbeinu Gershon, the ban of Rabbeinu Gershon is very clear. The ban is attributed to Rabbeinu Gershon, who is one of the greatest authorities of Franco-German Jewry in the 10th century, but it is by no means accepted by all that it was really his ban, that is this Rabbeinu Gershon's idea. Apparently, most scholars think so, it was in fact a collective decision by various rabbinic authorities at the time in France and Germany who came together. But because the greatest of all of them was Rabbeinu Gershon, the name was attributed to him. Now, according to this, there are a series of bans, there are a series of decisions that were taken at that time. There are 2 of which are the most important as far as we are concerned. One, it says, no man could marry a second wife while his first wife is still alive and still married to him. Full stop. Unless 100 rabbis from 3 countries allow him to do so. I often wonder whether that is a joke or really a pronouncement that wanted to say there is no possibility for a man really to marry a second wife. Because I cannot imagine how 100 rabbis from 3 countries or 3 regions could come together and all unanimously agree. But if the what? On anything and on that as well. So here we have really almost an impossibility. Unless, of course, one can think of a very, very delicate and unique situation. For example, if there is a problem of insanity with the wife, where a man cannot divorce a wife who is not really sane, 100% sane, let's say. And therefore, maybe in such circumstances, they thought to have 100 rabbis from 3. Why 3 regions? Of course, it complicates even more. Some versions say 3 countries, some say 3 regions. but even 3 regions like the Rhineland, Champagne, and so on, 3 countries would be Germany, France, Spain, and this is, of course, even far more complicated. But often the bans were restricted chronologically. No ban is pronounced forever, usually. There's a ban for 50 years, for 100 years, for 200 years. And this ban, when we look in all the versions that are at our disposal, we look in vain for a time limit. It is very strange. The only source that speaks of a limit for this ban of Rabbeinu Gershom is in a response of Rabbi Yosef Colon, who was in Italy, and he quotes a Sephardi rabbi from Spain who says, according to him, that the ban of Rabbeinu Gershom is until the end of the 5th millennium. That is 1240. Now, what is strange? It is strange that only a person who is much later, a rabbi who lived much later in Italy, should quote a Sephardi rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, who tells us, according to him, that the ban is until the end of the 5th millennium. Why should a Sephardi rabbi have any information more than Ashkenazi rabbis? And you will see in a moment why it is even much more strange than we think. In a moment, I will show you how it is difficult to imagine that Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, a Sephardi rabbi from Barcelona, should have had such a detail. Well, be that as it may, 1240 came, and all the enthusiastic Ashkenazi Jews who were waiting in the queue to marry a second wife were disappointed because the ban was not lifted, was never actually to be lifted.
I thought the ban was for 1,000 years and time is running out.
Yeah, I don't know your source for that. If you bring your source, we'll analyze it. You may be quoting now a Yemenite rabbi. And then, of course, the complications will be really there. But no, it was until the end of the 5,000 year in Jewish history, that is, the Hebrew calendar rather, and that coincided with 1240, and as I said, it was never lifted. By the way, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret lived after 1240, so I don't know, it's too complicated, the whole thing. What is important is that the ban remains until this very day in force. Now, I mentioned 2 bans. The second ban is of no less importance. The second ban says as follows: no Jew could ever divorce his wife against her will. Although there are all kinds of regulations that would not permit a man to do as he pleases, in theory, the decision to divorce, in most cases, was in the hands of the man. I said in theory because there are some, or more or less, because in some cases, in fact, a man has to divorce his wife. One of the instances I mentioned earlier, if a woman has a relationship with a second man, a man can't say, oh, I love my wife, even though she went with another man. No, in theory, he can't do it. But this second cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom against compulsory, or not compulsory, but against divorce at the will of the husband is very important, and they both show that in addition to these 2 cheramot, there were also other bans and other regulations, all show one clear picture. The synod that met and decided on the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom and other bans and other regulations meant one thing: to improve the status of the Jewish wife. There is no doubt about it that the 2 important bans, together with other regulations formulated and proclaimed at the time, they all had in mind one purpose, and that is to improve the status of the Jewish wife. The ketubah, there are other regulations, all in fact indicate the concern of the rabbis at the time that the Jewish wife should be should enjoy a status better than the one the law affords her or accords her. Now, how can we explain this decision by Franco-German rabbis that remains in vogue until this very day, in contrast to the situation in Muslim lands? If we agreed that under Islam, bigamous marriages among the Jews was the result of external social influence of outside society, I think we are very possibly right in assuming that the circumstances that prevailed in Christian society in Europe at the time permitted the rabbis to take a certain step. It's not that they decided because of Christianity, but the situation in Christian society, that is, the absolute prohibition against bigamous marriages, and by the way, the prohibition against divorce altogether. Now, these, of course, permitted the rabbis to take a decision which was not taken in any part of the Muslim world. This is the explanation. Now, where do we find a certain difficulty in applying the ban, the cherem? And what were the possibilities for a person to outdo the cherem? What happens if a man who was born in the Rhineland, who was born in any part of Franco-Germany, and he wanted to marry a second wife, could he do so if he passed now to a Muslim land, Spain or anywhere else? The ban and the later interpretation says definitely no. So even if one emigrated, an Ashkenazi Jew emigrated to a country where bigamous marriages were permitted, he would still be under the ban. And we have several instances, particularly in Spain, because this is the nearest country to Franco-Germany, where Jews came from the north and wanted to marry a second wife, claiming that now they live in a country where the ban is not actually accepted. And the Sephardi authorities, the rabbis in Spain, said, no, you're not allowed, because the ban in Franco-Germany applies actually personally on every Jew who is bound to that community. Now, what happens if a Sephardi Jew crosses the border and goes to Franco-Germany? Here, the ban also applies in the Middle Ages. So they said, in other words, unless he comes with two wives, when he would not be permitted, or we will not be obliged to divorce, if he came with one wife, or without any wife, and he wants to marry, claiming, oh, I'm a Sephardi Jew, I'm from Spain, I can marry, no. So, in other words, all the restrictions apply in every direction. For a man who leaves Franco-Germany, the ban accompanies him. For a man who comes from a country where the ban did not exist, the ban would actually now apply in his case. This is the situation. But now let's have a look at not the Muslim world, where the bigamy was never prohibited. How did they cope? How do really women, or did women in these countries have less sensitivity? Did they worry less than Jewish women in France or Germany? How did parents, particularly, did parents really want their daughter to be the second wife of a man? Of course, there were cases where it was so, particularly if the second wife, the candidate to become the second wife, comes from a poor family, and her parents thought that this is a real promotion for her and for them, for the whole family, to get married to a rich man, they might have allowed it. But on the whole, the parents were never happy to have their daughter marry a man as his second or third wife. And therefore, in all Sephardi countries, or Muslim lands rather, there is a condition that was inserted in the ketubah. We have plenty of ketubot, and anyone who's interested, particularly in Muslim and Sephardi lands, the ketubot were always illuminated, beautiful ketubot. And a friend of mine, Shalom Tzabar, published a book which is very nice. And there you can see the condition that was added. When in the wedding ceremony the ketubah was read and was signed, of course, the parents of the first wife, that is the wife, made sure that the condition is there very clearly pronounced. And he says, I, so and so, marry himself, and promise never to marry a second wife while you're alive, even though you permit me. Why this is so? Because it was feared that he might coerce, he might put pressure on his wife, saying, for example, I'll divorce you otherwise. So even though you will agree and you will say to the Bedin, I give him permission, no, you're not allowed. This is the way many families in many communities ensured that their daughters never become or never have tzoros. So the tzara like this was eliminated. I think since time is not available and without limits, I would like to just give you an idea about the situation in a country that was very, very problematic because it was on the borderline, and that's Christian Spain. When the Reconquista, the wars that were conducted by the Christians, brought about the large part of Spain under Christian control, in Castile, in the Crown of Aragon, Navarre and Portugal, there the question arose for the first time, what do we do? Because you are now in a society that was monogamous, Christian society. By the way, let me tell you this. People might think that bigamous marriages in Muslim lands among the Jews and monogamous marriages in Franco-Germany among the Jews indicate a different type of sexual morality. And particularly they compare, for example, Jewish society in Muslim lands possibly to Christian society. Now that is not true. The fact, for example, that Catholicism forbade, prohibited divorce did not actually prevent many men of having long affairs of long duration with women and neglecting, of course, their wives. So the prohibition of divorce has been a catastrophe in most Catholic countries, and of course until not long ago in some Catholic lands it was still prohibited to divorce. In Italy, but anybody who knows Italy will know also the conditions where men were never prevented from doing what their colleagues in other lands did, leaving of course a poor woman formerly married to them while they were having a second family, a third family somewhere in Italy, in the same city, sometimes in other cities. But in the medieval period, the fact that Christianity prohibited, why did I say that it's not the direct influence of the rabbis that made the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon possible. It was the circumstances that made it really possible. It was not the direct influence. Why? Because the conditions in Catholic Europe were far from being ideal, to say the least. For example, it is well known that Catholic priests were not allowed to marry, just as monks and nuns. Well, the information I have, which is all fully documented, shows the following picture. A pope in the 13th century sent a letter to the archbishops in Spain asking the archbishops to dismiss all the priests who had concubines. Of course, they were not married, but they had women. The answer of the archbishops to the Pope was like this: we can never do it, there will be no church left. So the situation was really disastrous. Furthermore, in miniature paintings that were drawn at the command of Alfonso X, the Wise of Castile, called Las Cantigas de Santa Maria, there we have 2,000 illuminations which are extremely important, and there we see Christian society in reality and not according to law and theory. And there we see, among other things, for example, men kneeling down, praying to God, and the next picture showing them now going to rob. So that it was a religious period. A person could have prayed to his God to help him before his venture to go and rob other people. This was not seen as contradictory. And in another painting that I recall, we see in one instance where monks and nuns were praying in very, very with great devotion, and the second picture shows them together having a relationship. Which I believe these reflect reality, so that there were a lot of problems. Yeah. Now, but coming back to Spain, in Spain we find the first attempt in a non-Ashkenazi community to apply the ban of Rabbeinu Gershon. But it is interesting, when I told you that Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret of Barcelona is the one who gives the information about the chronological limit of the ban, is the one in one of his responses where he says, he was asked, he said, I don't know anything about the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon. I don't know. And then later sources emanating from him that he wrote showed that every time he knew more and more. And where in the first instance he said, I don't know anything about it, and in these countries, he meant the Iberian Peninsula, Jews are allowed to marry a second wife, until the chronological last responsum, where he says, the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon must apply in our communities as well. How was he converted? Apparently, the more information he received from Ashkenazi and French rabbis who came to Spain convinced him of the necessity. And in one source that I found, which was when I published it about 13 years ago, I saw an Ashkenazi rabbi whom I mentioned on other occasions, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, came from Germany. While going to Toledo, he passed through Barcelona. And there he says, I met Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret. And we sat there and he asked me about the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon. And I gave him details. He asked me a lot of questions and I gave him all the information that was necessary. I have no doubt in my mind that by the beginning of the 14th century, 1303, that was when the meeting took place, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret now was equipped with all the full details about the ban against plural marriages, and that convinced him to apply. Some scholars did read the response that I mentioned of Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, and the last response, the chronological last response, where he said, Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon must apply, and they concluded mistakenly that the Jews of Spain now adopted monogamous marriage. No. I've proved that until the expulsion in 1492, bigamy was never prohibited in Spain. The fact that there were not many bigamous marriages should be attributed to other factors, to the social status of women who would not allow it, who might have put it as a condition, or the economic, demographic, and other conditions. But one thing is clear. We know of the few instances that were documented in the 13th, 14th, 15th century that in Spain, a bigamous marriage could take place. So that all the efforts of Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret to ban plural marriages did not bear fruit. And you know that in Muslim land this continued in several places, particularly in Morocco and in the Yemen. And so that in, this is just an addition to bring you up to date, where the Israeli law prohibits, of course, bigamous marriages, what could happen to a Jew who came from another country like the Yemen or the Morocco with 2 wives. And of course, Israeli law had to allow this situation to continue. You cannot break the family that was legally in the community of origin that was effected legally before their arrival. But now I will come to the last part of the lecture, and that's about concubinage and concubines. First of all, let me define the word concubine, in Hebrew, pilegesh. Of course, we have a pilegesh, we have concubines in the Bible. In the Bible, the concubine is a woman who seems to have been dedicated to one man without being married to him. Talmudic law defines her status very clearly, although there are some disagreements, but generally speaking, the following. When a woman is dedicated to one man, lives with him in an exclusive way, that is with no other man, except that she has no kiddushin and no ketubah, that is no marriage and no contract was effected, this is a pilegesh. And she is forbidden to any other man. Now, there is no evidence that after the biblical period that Jews had concubines in the Talmudic period. We don't have any evidence. In the Middle Ages, I read recently, well, some time ago, amazingly, that they said there was no concubine among the Jews. And I found evidence to the contrary. Particularly in Spain, and the reason why in Spain, of all places, I will explain in a moment. First of all, the situation in Spain was such because of the political conditions that Jews are known to have had non-Jewish concubines. Non-Jewish concubines, of course, have no status whatsoever in Jewish law, because Jewish law does not even allow the possibility to arise of a case where a man would have relations with a non-Jewish person. Why? Because it was not necessary to do so. The reason is obvious. Under Islam and under Christianity, the death penalty awaited any Jew who had sexual intercourse with a Muslim in the Muslim world, a Muslim woman, and a Christian woman in Christian Europe. So of course, unless somebody took the risk, there was no such a possibility. All right. Now, why in Spain it was different? In Spain, it was different because Jews lived in Spain under both Muslims and Christians. In the south, where the Muslims were in control, the Jews could afford, without risking their lives, to have a Christian concubine. And in the north, under the Christians, the Jews allowed themselves to have a Muslim concubine. This is, of course, the great advantage of Muslim Jewry. Of course, I'm saying this ironically, that the Spanish Jews were in a situation that they could afford to have non-Jewish women because of the special situation. And we have responses. That's why I'm surprised some of the scholars who did not realize that this was the condition, because the responsa literature shows, and Latin documents show us, that this was the case, because we have instances where a man had, say, a Muslim concubine in Toledo, in Barcelona, and suddenly he realized that she was pregnant. And what did he do? Immediately he went and he wanted her to be converted so that the child to be born will be Jewish. Because, of course, if the child is born without the concubine, the Muslim concubine being Jewish, of course, the child is not even considered his. It is just biologically his, but in Jewish law, that child has no status whatsoever because he's not a Jew. Now, this is as far as the non-Jewish concubines were concerned. Obviously, you can imagine that the rabbinic authorities were so much against this, presenting it as an immoral behavior of these Jews, and there is censure throughout the writings of the Spanish rabbis about such a misbehavior of Jews who allowed themselves to have relations with their either Christian or Muslim women. At times they were actually the maids, maids serving in their houses, and this happened. The most, however, interesting and serious situation is where men in Spain had Jewish concubines. And in the 13th century, we have a very serious argument between two rabbis who were cousins. One is well known, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides. And the other one is his cousin, Rabbi Jonah Gerondi. Both of them from the town of Gerona in northeastern Spain, in Catalonia. Rabbi Jonah Gerondi studied in Evreux, in France. He was very much influenced by the French school of Tosophists, of the Talmudic scholars. He returned to Spain disgusted with some of the customs of his Sephardi brethren. And he said that, of course, among other things, that there should be, under no circumstance, that any Jew should be allowed to have a Jewish woman as a pilegesh, as a concubine. A concubine, that is to say, this is a woman known to be his. And to our great surprise and shock sometimes, Nachmanides, he allowed it. Why did he do so? Nachmanides was no less a pious Jew, and he was very much against this practice. But, he said, Nachmanides was far more realistic. This is the situation, he says. If we are to forbid it, this will be underground. It will be secret, and we will not know about the children. It is better. We should not encourage it. But if there is a case where a man is known to have a certain woman exclusively his, and not his wife, but exclusively his, it is better to permit the situation to continue like this, and so that we know that the children, who the father is and who the mother is, and there should be no problems for later on. Of course, these children of the concubine are purely 100% Jews. There's no problem. The only problem is that what happens if they go underground, these children will grow up, they might even marry their half brothers or sisters, which is, of course, absolutely forbidden. Therefore, Nachmanides said, this is the situation, I am not happy with it, but I rather have this condition sanctioned by rabbinic decision, so that we will be able to know exactly what is happening. And so, some permitted it, some agreed it is legal, but morally not permitted, like Nachmanides, and others forbade it, like Rabbi Jonah Gerondi. The picture that we have here, I'm sorry that we'll not have time to speak about the chuppah, the wedding ceremony, and so on. I knew right from the beginning that our time will not allow us further details, but the picture that is here very clear is this, that the Jewish family, of course, was totally Jewish family life was totally regulated by Jewish law. That this is one of the domains in which the Jews made no compromises. There was no such a thing, because Jewish law was absolutely practiced in the case of marriages. Where, however, there was a loophole, a possibility for a deviation from practice, not from the law, under the influence of Islam or Christianity, this was done. Hence, some of the differences between Jewish communities living in different cultural, social, economic, and political milieux. Thank you. Now, those of you who have to leave, I understand, can do so, but those who would like to comment and ask questions, I'll be pleased to do. Yeah. So, yes.
I'm wondering, you said that in a Muslim society, a Jewish man could have a Christian concubine in a Christian society, but I thought they didn't travel that much. Where would he find a Christian concubine
yes.
Muslim, and opposite?
I'm sorry that my the pressure of time sometimes does not allow me to explain enough, and sometimes maybe I assume that things are clearly understood. No. In countries which are on borderline between Christendom and Islam, there was a Muslim society under Christian rule and a Christian society under Muslim rule. In Spain is the obvious case, where for a long time, after the conquest of territories by the Christians, there was a Muslim minority living besides the Christians and the Jews, and under Islam there was a Christian population living next to the Muslims and the Jews. It was only in such places. That's why there was no possibility for a Jew, say, in Egypt or in the Yemen, to have a concubine. But in Spain it was possible because such minorities existed. All right? Give it up.
But it has to do with Muslim law. You said that a man can divorce his wife by just saying divorce, divorce, divorce.
Yes.
Can he remarry her after she married another man or not? Or is it like among the Jews?
He can remarry her for sure if he wants, if she is not married. The question if...
after she married another person.
Why would she do
I
it?
cannot.
Oh,
He changed his mind.
because in ours or is it in the
Or maybe she pleases him more now when he sees her with another man. He's getting jealous. He wants her. I am at the moment not in a position to give you a proper, sure answer. I am not very sure now, really. There 100% that he can remarry. If she's already married with another person, and whether he remarries her, it's a very good question, but I am not sure at the moment. I can't give you an answer. Yes, sir.
Nachmanides obviously was a pragmatist in the case of concubines.
Who?
Nachmanides
Yes,
was
yes,
a pragmatist.
yes, yes.
Why can't our rabbis be today be pragmatists about mixed marriages? How would Nachmanides act today in the case of mixed marriage, matrilineal and matrilineal descent?
Right. Yes. I think I can't speak for Nachmanides. What Nachmanides would have done today, I can only imagine, but I can't really say in absolute confidence. But I think, however, I am in a position to give you a clear distinction between Nachmanides' permission granted in the case of a concubine at the time, Jewish concubine, yes, and the case of mixed marriages today. When he allowed, because of the circumstances, and he was being pragmatic, he allowed a man to have a concubine, he was not breaking any biblical law. There was no transgression of any law. There is a pronouncement on moral grounds against such a behavior. But Jewish law, ever since the Bible until modern times, has nothing really clear to say about a man who has a relationship with a woman who is not married. There's nothing. If a man has a relationship with a person who is not his wife, and who is not married, I emphasize, Jewish law does not say anything except moral condemnation. All right? But what happens to a man who goes with a woman with whom he is not married? His children? There's no problem. There is no problem, as long as we know that she's not married. Now, therefore, Nachmanides was worried. Let us not drive them underground, secret illicit relations. Let her be known as his woman, not to say his wife. In the case of mixed marriages, the situation is completely different. There is a problem of breaking a law, and also of children who, according to Jewish law, to which, of course, Nachmanides fully was a part, and he accepted it, is that the descendants or the children of a non-Jewish wife or woman would not be Jewish. And to be Jewish, they have to be converted. In that case, we return to the same original question.
Which law is there? Is it directly, explicitly stated?
The explicit halakha is that children of a woman who is not Jewish are not Jewish.
Where is it written in the Bible?
It's not written in the Bible. It is the halakha that is deduced in the Mishnah. Of course, in the Bible there are numerous instances of women who were not of Jewish origin. And I would like to refer not to the pre-biblical figures, because that doesn't really explain anything, but to the not the post-biblical, but the biblical period after Matan Torah, and that is, for example, the case of Ruth the Moabite. In the case of Ruth the Moabite, the rabbis, of course, nobody can claim that there was a process of conversion. The book of Ruth does not say anything. The only thing that the rabbis quote in the case of Ruth the Moabite is where she says, "Your God is my God and your people are my people." And I think here there is a case, even though one might claim that there was no formal procedure of conversion, but that there was here an acceptance by Ruth, the faith and the nationality of the person with whom she was involved. And of course, this is the best example not only of showing that Judaism in its essence is far from being racist, because the greatest men of our people have come from non-Jewish women, non-Israelite women, Ruth the Moabite, Rabbi Akiva, and many others. But here I think I am not going to give you a metaphysical answer about the certain conversion that took place with Ruth and others. What I can say, and in your comment, where is it written? It doesn't have to be written. The halakha was formulated in a very clear way. The halakha states that a person is Jewish. Either he is born to a Jewish mother or is a convert to Judaism. And it's not enough to be born to a Jewish man. Nachmanides did accept this halakha. Whether today he would have behaved in a different way, it's beyond, of course, my possibility to give. Yes, sir.
This concern of protecting wives from competition or multiple wives goes way back in Torah. The patriarchs, they had a secondary wife. One. And then Laban concerns himself with Jacob. He makes him swear that he will not take any extra other wives. So
correct me if I am wrong, you entered a bit late.
Yeah.
Because I did begin the lecture by quoting the reservations in the Torah. More than what you have quoted, I mentioned the very clear biblical pronouncement. When a man takes two women, one is loved and one is hated or less loved, etc., etc. And I did elaborate on this, so I thank you for this, and of course I did mention it. Yes?
Which dominated, morality or economics? Were there Jewish prostitutes at this time?
Well, it is the tendency in every generation is to see the past better than the present. I have nothing against it. Anybody can think so. I am an expert of the past, and I make it my business to know the past. I don't claim that I know the present. Now, contrary to what people think, morality has not always been great. I'm not suggesting that it was worse than today, but your direct question about Jewish prostitutes, the answer is positive 100%. That there were women who were such. I have written about it in English, by the way, in an article called Sexual Behavior in Hispanic Jewish Society in the Middle Ages. And I showed there to the people who did not like what I wrote, but this is the truth. I showed how in several communities there were women who were actually known as prostitutes. And in one case in Saragossa, where a man came to the Beit Din with a complaint. He said, when I bought this house, I thought I bought a nice house. And now next door, there is a house where some women are operating, and they have men coming in and out, and I feel terrible. So from this is clear that he was bothered by the Jewish women who were actually acting as prostitutes. In another most interesting case, in a responsum that we find in 13th century Spain, a community asked the rabbi what to do. A certain rabbi. The community was divided into two. Those who wanted to throw out the Jewish prostitutes, and those who were against throwing them out. Now, the rabbis decided against throwing them out, but the most amazing thing is the answer he gave. He said, it is better that the seed, the holy seed of Israel, be mixed with Jews rather than they should go to non-Jewish prostitutes. Now, this is of course an answer that is given in one case that should not be generalized. Some other rabbis might have disagreed with him totally. There were therefore such instances, obviously with the very, very strong criticism by the moralists and the rabbis at the time. The Jewish community was very unhappy, but men did not always behave nicely, and the presence of Jewish prostitutes meant, of course, the cooperation and collaboration of some Jewish men. And the same also applies to other types of behavior. But there were in us. Yes, let me see how many people. Accordingly, I will shorten. Sorry, 3 questions we have. 4 questions, 5. Okay. Now let's set it down. Right. Let's one by one. I will go according to the. Yes.
Wasn't there concern for the children of the Jewish concubines? Because weren't they considered monsters?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning because there was some talking. Okay, please.
Were the children of the Jewish concubines considered monsters?
No,
Because they weren't married?
That's exactly the Nachmanides position. He said, I want to make sure that the children who were born to a concubine, to a Pilegesh, should be absolutely accepted as full members of the community. Therefore, it is better, he said, I don't agree with the behavior of the person, he said, but I am thinking of the children. That's what he said.
But this is only here in Spain.
No. Yeah, of course, concubinage could not have taken place everywhere, but the children of a Jewish concubine, or of a Jewess not married, let's say, to a man, if she was known to have had no relationship with other people, the children are 100% Jewish, kasher, and not mamzerim. That's for sure. All right? Second, yeah. The name what? The family name? the family name is of no consequence, of no importance. The father, of course, the question of the inheritance does appear, and there is a lot of things here concerning this, and there are a lot of problems between the children of his married wife and the children of the concubine, so the complications are many. That is why we know about the existence of such women in Spain, because of the problems that really were raised for inheritance and so on. But there were problems. I cannot elaborate. Now, there's 4 more people. Yes, please.
You brought up the problem of the legacy. It got me to thinking, Abraham and Hagar. Would you consider her?
Well, of course. Sure. Suppose, yes. But there is a clear. First of all, as I said, there is no clear prohibition of a man having an affair with a woman, a particular woman who is not married. There is something against it on moral grounds. In the case of Abraham, I think no incident should be brought, or no event should be brought from the period before the Bible, because there was no problem. And the fact that Jacob married 2 sisters, which is absolutely prohibited by Jewish law. So the Midrash says, oh no, outside Israel there was no problem, because the law is to be applied in Israel, and therefore Rachel died, poor Rachel died before they entered Israel. This is, of course, only a Midrash. In reality, until the law existed, of course, there were various customs, there were beliefs, there was levirate marriage, we know from the case of Judah, because it was practiced by other peoples in the area as well. So until Matan Torah, until the giving of the law, until the law was there was no problem of such.
Moshe married a Midianite woman.
All right. So it's another case, of course, like Ruth the Moabite. How it was at the time, I cannot now elaborate. Obviously, everybody, Tamar, King David, not only from a Moabite, but Tamar, Judah's second wife, in inverted commas, she was not even his wife, because he had his twins by mistake. He thought she was just an available woman in the street, and in the end she was pregnant. And who came from that relationship? King David. So there was no Torah, and we cannot relate to this period in history. Yes.
How about the communities in Israel, Syria, and Lebanon? Over there they had Christians and Muslims living together. Did they have the same problems as the people in Spain area?
No, we have no evidence of such a situation where in other countries where we do have Christians and Muslims living, it is not very clear why. I think because probably in Spain the transition was at the time very, very imminent at the time, and people profited from the situation where a certain Muslim community under, let's say, difficult situation, they profited from the situation. Whereas in the Middle East, Christians and Muslims had lived now from the 7th century onwards for centuries to come, and the status of Jews, Christians under Islam in the Near East was very clearly defined, and Jews did not allow themselves. And furthermore, the Jews in Spain enjoyed a status much higher, and they allowed themselves this kind of permissive laxity in their conduct. 2 more questions? Yes.
So the Jews in the Middle East really could not afford having concubines?
No, there were no concubines. Jewish ones, yes, but not Christian or... Yeah.
Is there any instance in the 18th century Sephardic or Ashkenazic world where you have a rabbinical dynasty, and for whatever reason either this rabbi's wife doesn't want to give him the divorce, or she's insane and she can't have any male children, where this conclave of Rebbeim got together and permitted him to have a second wife in order for him to produce a male heir for his rabbinical dynasty?
Are you stating or are you asking?
I'm asking.
I am not aware of any synod that was convened specially for 100 rabbis to come together in order to permit a certain marriage. The problems that arose, a question of insanity of a woman, which of course it would be forbidden for any man, whether Sephardi or Ashkenazi, to divorce her because it's understandable. It was solved at times by rabbis. They needed, of course, to consult psychologists who were not available in those days. But where a moment of sanity was clearly seen, that was the only time. But otherwise, there was a lot of suffering. But I think this law is understandable, that a woman who suffers psychological insanity or something that should not be abandoned just like that, despite the fact that there's a tragic consequence as far as the man is concerned, it's part of the tragic consequences of a certain situation. But I'm not aware of any such synods that took place. There were a lot of problems, however. That doesn't mean that there were not problems in consultations and letters sent from between communities. And the last, yes, madam, you had a question.
Married woman, suppose she gets raped, she gets pregnant, okay, where Allah stands, and does her husband have to divorce her?
A wonderful question. So, very good question. You know how to make life difficult for me. Yes. This is a wonderful question because the halachic authorities of all periods had to cope with very tragic consequences of Jewish life in the exile. It's not the circumstances of a nation living in its own land, in its being able to control its destiny. There are, let me give you the examples, 2 examples from the Sephardi and Ashkenazi world to show how the rabbinic authorities has to cope with difficult problems of the nature that you have mentioned now. What happens to a person in Spain when a Jew, for example, converted, and his wife did not convert? And there were many instances. The women were always more loyal than men to Judaism. Have always been so. And in many instances, the women remained Jewish and the men converted, right? And he doesn't give the get. You have to give get, even though he converted. And the rabbis in Spain had to cope with this matter, and they did it wonderfully well. And there is not one instance that is dealt with in the responsa literature where we do not have actually the result. Somehow they found the way to put pressure on the convert now, on a Jew who is becoming Christian, to give his wife a get, or to give his sister-in-law the chalitza, because there was a question also, sometimes I didn't have the time to mention the differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, whereas this Ashkenazim said only chalitza, that is to say, when a man's brother dies childless, according to the Torah, either the brother has to marry his wife, or give her chalitza to free her, to liberate her from any bond that she should be able to marry. What happens in the case of a person who doesn't give this chalitza, of a converso? And in all the cases, the ways were found in order to exert pressure on the converso in order to give the get. Either by giving money to the king, or him, or they found every way to. But when everything is said and done, when converso people, descendants of converso, came to the Middle East to rejoin the Jewish people, people asked, how do we know? They might have had now such relationships among themselves that there may be mamzerim. They might have had relations with women who were married previously, etc., etc. All these problems were solved. We don't have one single instance of a person who returned to Judaism from converso life who was not fully accepted as a Jew. The case from the Ashkenazi world is the Khmelnytsky massacres, where thousands of women were massacred or raped. Raped, and they had children, and they were married. I'm not talking about single girls who were raped, and the child, of course, is a child and is a Jew, and no problem. What happened? In all these cases, they were solved. All these cases were solved. I know that when a question like this is asked, the immediate, of course, attention is focused on Israel today, particularly because where Jewish law is applied in the case of marriage and so on, marital status. And there seems to be a lack of, probably lack of inspiration, ingenuity, etc., and initiative on the part of some rabbinic authorities to solve the problems. There are problems. Unfortunately, the political conditions in Israel make the problem far graver than it should have been. I have a lot personally to say on the matter, but let me just say one thing. It has become now more and more obvious that the recent immigration of people, by the way, Ovadia Yosef's pronouncement a few years ago that all the Ethiopian Jews are Jewish and to be accepted as Jews, as a historian, I find it the most liberal and difficult decision that I've ever encountered as far as the status, Jewish status of any person is concerned. In this respect, as a historian, if I were asked, I could not have given the answer that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef gave so absolutely and clearly. I am really amazed. So it shows some kind of liberalism despite everything. But in recent years, it has become obvious that a very large percentage of those Jews who came from Soviet Russia or ex-Soviet Union, all these places, up to almost 30% apparently, are not Jews according to halakha. Once one of the ministers said so, and they almost killed him. But it's become now obvious, the government agrees that this is so, and I think if the political politicians would not be involved, the resolution of the problem and the solution of the problem would be more forthcoming than otherwise. I didn't get it. This is the statistics that have been published in Israel. 25 to 30%. I'm not talking about some of the people who lied and they're not at all Jewish, who came and it's obvious there's a big problem. I'm talking about people who were allowed because the law of return does not say that a Jew who is permitted to come to Israel must be a Jew according to Allah. So what happens is that if a person has a grandparent, one of the 4 grandparents Jewish, he's allowed to come to Israel. But he might not have been practicing Judaism, not only, I'm not talking about Orthodox observance, but he never even considered himself Jewish. But now, the situation in Russia is such that it's better for him to be in Israel than to be in Russia. So he comes. Now, in a second instance, in another instance, he would be, of course, even if he considered himself Jewish, he was not conscious and he was not aware of what the halakha was. So he comes. I have one instance, not from Russia, where for years a friend of mine who behaved as a Jew, who was sent to a Jewish school, his mother was Greek Orthodox, his father was a Jew. And then his cousin, the son of his aunt, that is, the aunt was Jewish and the father was Christian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and that cousin behaved as a Christian. When I met my friend for the first time, he is now a great surgeon in Beilinson in Israel, one of the great, famous people. And when I met him, I didn't realize, and we became friendly and so on, and one day I said to him, look, he became very observant and so on. I said to him, look, you've got to undergo this ceremony, you are Jewish and so on and so on. He did, became a Jew, and he came to Israel, and he lives as a Jew, he has a family, and as I said, he's one of the greatest physicians today in Beilinson. Now, his cousin came to Israel from a certain country because the situation was terrible there. He grew up as a Greek, and he was a Jew according to halakha, and the other one was not a Jew according to halakha. And he came, and I saw him, and I was shocked. He spoke Greek always when I met him in a certain country, and I met him, and he came as a Jew, but he was not a Jew. He was not a Jew. Halachically he was a Jew, but he didn't behave as a Jew. He never felt as a Jew. A year later, he was gone. And my friend, who was not halachically a Jew, became a Jew halachically and remained. And you know the famous brother Daniel and so on. I think the halakha could be very, very lenient. The fact that today nobody is asking that 25% of all those who came should be dispatched back to Russia. But there should be an immediate solution to the problem. If it is within the halakha, it would allow then the children and grandchildren of all Jews in the future to marry among themselves without problem. If the solution is not with the halakha, of course the problem is there. I think if the politicians would not interfere, it might have been better, although I am far from claiming that the rabbis in Israel are really today equipped with the bright ingenuity and the tolerance that are needed in order to solve problems. But the politicians also are not equipped with that. Thank you very much.